For more than 20 years, one man has really had Russia in his grip. But how? Today, we're going to deconstruct Vladimir Putin's playbook and get into the spy tactics he uses to hold on to absolute power.
Right, let's dive straight in. This is the central question, isn't it? The paradox of Vladimir Putin's rule. How does one guy keep such tight control for so long? Well, the answer isn't just about politics. It's really a masterclass in strategy, psychology, and, you guessed it, intelligence.
I mean, just think about that for a second. Since the year 2000, Putin has been the one constant at Russia's helm. There's a whole generation of people who have grown up knowing no other leader. And now, with some recent constitutional changes, he could be in power until 2036.
Okay, but here's where it gets really fascinating. Despite all the authoritarian tactics we're about to get into, the source material we're looking at shows that a staggering 84% of young Russians have a positive view of him. How is that even possible?
This is what we're calling the Putin Paradox. This immense popularity in the face of what many would call manipulated elections and a totally crushed opposition. So to solve this paradox, we have to rewind. We have to go back and look at the Russia that he inherited.
You see, the 1990s in Russia, it wasn't just a time of change. It was a decade of complete and utter national collapse. The source we're using actually calls it a jungle raj, which basically means the law of the jungle. Total, unadulterated chaos.
The numbers here tell a story of an absolute free fall. The GDP, it crashed by 40%. Inflation skyrocketed to an almost unimaginable 10,000%, which just wiped out people's life savings overnight. And at the same time, the crown jewels of the state, we're talking oil companies worth billions, were being sold for pennies on the dollar to a new class of super rich businessmen, the oligarchs. For the average person, it was just a time of pure desperation. And President Yeltsin's approval rating, it hit rock bottom at a mere 2%. And then, terror struck. In the span of just 2 weeks in September of 1999, a series of absolutely horrific apartment bombings killed over 300 people and just plunged the entire nation into fear. Russia was on its knees, and it was desperate for a savior. Into this chaos walks a pretty unknown figure, the acting Prime Minister, Vladimir Putin. And his response to these bombings, well, it wasn't polished or political, it was raw, it was decisive, and it was exactly what a terrified nation was desperate to hear. This decisive action basically made Putin a national hero overnight. But his methods, they weren't learned in some parliament building, they were forged in the shadows, taken straight from the playbook of the KGB, where he spent 15 years as an intelligence officer. As Putin himself once said, that training, it never leaves you. So let's do this. Let's break down the 4 key KGB tactics he brought with him from the world of espionage right into the Kremlin.
All right, first up, active measures. Now, this is a cornerstone of KGB strategy. It's not really about winning a direct fight. It's about shaping the entire battlefield of information itself. Using misinformation and manipulation to sideline your opponents and completely control the story. Putin applied this tactic to the media right away. Any independent channels that were critical of his government, they were just systematically dismantled. Their owners were hit with fraud charges or targeted with investigations, forcing them to sell out to state-controlled companies like Gazprom. And the result? A total takeover. Within a decade, 90% of Russian media was in the Kremlin's hands. And the human cost? It was chilling. Between 2000 and 2010, dozens of high-profile journalists died under very suspicious circumstances. The second tactic is chillingly efficient. You don't need these massive purges to create a climate of fear. Nope. You just need to make a very public, very brutal example of one powerful person who dares to step out of line. The old KGB mantra was punish one, teach 100. And the perfect example of this is Mikhail Khodorkovsky. Back in 2003, he was the richest man in Russia. His big mistake? He started funding opposition parties. Putin's response was swift and totally theatrical. A public arrest on an airport tarmac, a 9-year jail sentence, and the complete seizure of his multi-billion-dollar oil company. The message to every other oligarch was brutally clear. Your fortune is safe, but politics is absolutely forbidden. So if public punishment keeps the powerful in line, the third tactic, compromise, well, that controls everyone else. It's a simple little word for a very powerful weapon, compromising material, stuff that's used to blackmail or discredit anyone who might become a threat.
The principle behind it is simple and honestly deeply cynical. Everyone has a secret. Everyone has a weakness that can be exploited.
and the KGB's job was to find it and file it away for a rainy day.
Our source material shows how Putin basically institutionalized this whole process, tasking his intelligence service, the FSB, with collecting data on every single person of influence. And the results? They speak for themselves. They play out like something from a political thriller. A former prime minister's career completely destroyed by a strategically leaked intimate video. A top opposition leader discredited by footage of his allies appearing to take foreign money. An oligarch in exile undermined by leaked audio recording. It's this invisible web of political control.
So you have these three tactics: controlling the information, punishing dissent, and collecting secrets. And they all come together for the final and most ambitious goal: creating a controlled reality. Because when you control what people see and what they fear, you can shape their entire perception of the world. Just take a look at this. An event happens, right? But the reality that's presented to the public is completely different depending on where you are. What the West calls an invasion, Russian state media calls a homecoming. What is seen as aggression is framed as liberation. And by repeating this narrative over and over and over, for millions of people, it becomes the truth. So why? Why build this whole controlled reality? What's the end game here? Well, according to our source, it's all in service of a really grand ambition. One born from what Putin famously called the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century, the collapse of the Soviet Union. The source lays out this 5-part strategy that's all aimed at rebuilding a Soviet-style sphere of influence. It starts by pushing back against NATO. Then it weaves this economic web through trade blocs and a military umbrella through alliances. And when those things don't work, it resorts to direct intervention, like we saw in Georgia and Ukraine. And the whole thing is wrapped in this ideology of protecting a so-called Russian world. This grand ambition, combined with all the tactics we've just talked about, leads our source to a final and frankly a deeply unsettling historical parallel.
Yeah, the source draws a really chilling parallel in their paths to power. You've got a leader rising from the ashes of national crisis and humiliation, a promise to restore greatness by creating an external enemy, and then finally, the annexation of neighboring lands, all justified by the need to protect people who share their language and culture.
But, and this is a crucial distinction from our source, Putin has read the history books. He knows how that story ends. His preference for hybrid warfare, using information, cyber attacks, economic pressure, suggests this is a 21st century update to the autocrat's playbook. So maybe the real question isn't whether history is repeating itself, but how it's being rewritten for a new era. One where power is waged not just with armies, but with information, with fear, and with a reality that's controlled from the very top.